space. We have a lot of people coming tonight, so we're just gonna give it a couple seconds and then we'll get started. Hi, welcome, happy Friday. Happy day after Earth Day. This is a very timely discussion for Earth Day weekend celebration. Okay, great. Looks like people are getting in. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, and then as people come in, they can join us. But welcome everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot. I am the Director of Events for Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. And I'm so excited to have you all here for us for this event. I want to start things off by thanking our friends at the New Republic for co-sponsoring this event with us. And if you don't already know about the New Republic, definitely should. So I will put a link in the chat where you can find out more about their magazine and their mission. A few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. First, I will be dropping links in the chat where you can order a copy of Overheated by Kate Aronoff, as well as Jane Fonda's book, What Can I Do? From Politics and Prose. So just check the chat for those links. Also, we are glad to be able to offer closed captioning via Zoom, and I'm going to turn that on right now. There we go. So closed captioning via Zoom, you can access the captions by clicking on the live transcript option with the CC image at the bottom of your screen. And you can turn it on and off if you don't need it. And finally, if you have a question for either one of our speakers, please enter it into the Q&A space at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those, as many of those as we can, in the latter part of the event. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. First, Kate Aronoff is a staff writer at the New Republic, a fellow at Type Media Center, and a senior fellow at Data for Progress. Her book, Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, is a damning account of the forces that have hijacked progress on climate change. In it, Ironoff shares a bold vision of what it will take to face the existential threat of global warming head on. Also joining us is the incomparable Jane Fonda, a two-time Oscar winner and an Emmy-winning actress and political activist. Her latest book, What Can I Do? My Path from Climate Despair to Action, urges us to wake up to the looming disaster of climate change and equips us with the tools we need to join her in protest. 100% of the net proceeds from What Can I Do will go to Greenpeace, and you can donate to the organization via a link that I will put in the chat box soon. So please help me welcome Kate and Jane to your screens.
Hi, everybody. Glad you're here. Hi, Kate. I want to thank you for your book. It's a really good book. I learned so much. And I want to start off by asking you, how did you decide to write this book?
Well, thank you so much, Jane, for being here and moderating this conversation. I can think of basically no one else I would rather hear say nice things about the book. You're such an icon of the 20th century, and I can't think of anyone who's been more right more on the right side of history than you. So thank you so much for being here. How did I decide to write this book? So I have been a climate writer on the climate beat for about 5 years. And before that, I worked in the fossil fuel divestment movement as a college student, really all through college. And then when I graduated, wanted to report on social movements, wanted to sort of talk to people who were doing this work. So I've been sort of around the climate movement space for a long time, and had spent a lot of my time as a reporter talking to people in movements, right? Talking to people in environmental justice struggles and climate justice struggles, and really, trying to get a sense for what was happening on the ground. And I hadn't really talked to that many climate scientists. I hadn't delved into that discussion. I majored in history, so it was not, talking about parts per million and things like that was a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But at some point decided that was valuable to go and talk to some climate scientists. And so about 2016, when I was in my first staff writing job at In These Times, I talked to a climate scientist and just asked him, if you were to sort of design your sort of ideal program for keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius, what would you sort of do? What would that entail? What would that look like on a policy level? And very nonchalantly, he just told me, there would be no internal combustion cars on the road in the next 5 years, right? Every cooktop in every home in the country would be electric. There would be no coal-fired power plants. We would get rid of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And I sort of knew all this, like coming in, I knew some version of that story from, talking to different people. But it was so far off from what the political discussion was at the time, really across the political spectrum. So obviously, Republicans were denying the existence of climate change, fighting anything called climate change. But among people who were interested in taking on the problem, who believed that climate change was a real issue, those proposals also were not proposing to do the sorts of things that science was saying was necessary, right? We're sort of tweaking around the edges, sort of trying to, create market-based mechanisms to nudge away at the problem, to slowly build up renewable energy. And that gulf was just so far. And so most of the book and a lot of the reporting I've done since then has been trying to understand, well, why does that gap exist? Why is, what's needed and what's on the table so far off? And I'm happy to say that, over the course of writing this book, those things have come together a little bit, certainly not as much as they need to, but there has been a lot of movement in the last couple of years to make that the case. And the last thing I'll say, just as a, talk a little bit more about, why I decided to write this book in particular, was going to different UN climate talks, going to these sort of summits where people come together to talk about this during the Trump administration. So while the US was on its way out of the Paris Agreement, and then seeing the bar just be so low for what constituted a sort of good line on climate change. I remember in Bonn in 2017, going to this thing called the US Climate Action Summit, outside of the gates because the US didn't have its official pavilion like it normally does within the UN, and saw, Jerry Brown, governor of California, on stage with a lot of, CEOs of several companies who are, themselves very polluting. I think PG&E was up there, and just really patting each other on the back about saying climate change was real and really nothing else. And then, there was a disruption of that event by, folks who had been fighting Jerry Brown's fossil fuel policies. And, they were really sort of disturbed that anybody was calling them out for not, not addressing this problem at the scale it deserves. And so just seeing how low the bar was and kind of why that was the case. Why was this weird sort of American thing called climate denial? How had that shifted the conversation so much here? And, what might we do about that? And so, yeah.
So why, I know what I think. Why do you think all of these good-looking young progressives, why do they refuse to call the culprit by its name, fossil fuels? Why do you think?
Well, I think an easy thing to point to, and a big part of the story, is money, right? So, fossil fuel money, particularly in, big fossil fuel producing states like California, is ubiquitous in the political system. So that's from the fossil fuel industry itself, both like refiners like Chevron and drillers, but also from electric utilities who, are just inundating the political system with cash. And that's true in many places across this country, right? In Virginia, Dominion Energy is control state politics in a big way, even with the Democratic majority in the legislature there. Really, you can look at so many states and just see fossil fuel influence really pouring through in ways that it goes, under the radar in some cases. And so I think the money is a part of it. I also think there's a story that I try to trace through the book about the Democratic Party. If we're talking about the good-looking liberals in particular, I think that's a big part of the story about how the Democratic Party sort of evolved in response to really the country moving right through the 1980s and the late 70s, and trying to sort of figure out a way to make corporations the protagonist of social change, right? To make it so that, markets and corporations, if you just sort of incentivize them the right way to do the right thing, that will produce the sort of results we need, right? And then it just infects this sort of theory of change that, you can sort of see a logic to it, right? In the midst of Reaganism, in the midst of, the kind of new democratic push through the 1990s. But it, really sort of takes over as this theory of change about how politics works and really, displaces government as being, a potential source of good in people's lives.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Money, especially for the right wing and Republicans, But you know, one can be pretty shocked how many Democrats don't talk about fossil fuels. The Green New Deal doesn't talk about fossil fuels, and that's because of labor. Well, it's also because of money, but it's primarily labor. I mean, with Jerry Brown, with our Governor Newsom right here, the building trades. Oh my God, that's partly money because they give money to politicians, but you know, they need the support of the unions. And it's kind of ridiculous because, you know, I've been trying to stop line 3 up in northern Minnesota, and everybody says, oh, but the workers. There's 1,500 workers working on it, okay? We're gonna blow our carbon budget over 1,500 jobs when you could put them to work right away, mitigating the damage that they've done. It's shovel ready. Don't you agree that labor is a big cause of why they steer clear?
Yeah, and I think it's a thorny story, right? I think it's a really complicated story. But you know, among Democrats, I think that's certainly true. And you know, I think it's. I understand why there are unions who say that they can't see a just transition happening. You know, there hasn't been one, right, in the history of this country. So it's hard to imagine that.
But they're doing it in other countries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there are better models for how to do that, and plenty and plenty of work. And I think one of the most ingenious things, honestly, the fossil fuel industry has done is sort of say that they're the friend of the worker, that they're the friend of the little man. When
coal miners.
Yeah, their entire history is busting unions, right? That's why, you know, 120,000 people got laid off in the last year when fossil fuel companies were collecting money from the federal government. You know, they don't like workers. They're on track to, you know, automate 30% of their jobs and lay off 140,000 more people in the next decade. Fossil fuel industries are not friends of workers, and you know, I think it's very sad that that's the story that gets told.
Right. ExxonMobil knew that what they were burning was causing damage to the climate, was warming the climate, and they knew what the consequences of that might be because their scientists told them. They knew in the 1970s. Listen to this, you in the audience. They knew in the 1970s the fires, the floods, the droughts, all of that could happen because of what they were burning. And yet the climate crisis didn't really enter the public imagination until the late 80s, you know, years into the Ronald Reagan presidency. Tell us about how fossil fuel executives hid the truth and what it means in terms of time is running out.
Yeah, you know, the story I try to lay out in the book kind of looks at how all these different strains of right-wing thinking really converge on this moment where climate change becomes a part of the public debate in the US in a way that it hadn't been before. That happens when climate scientist James Hansen gives his testimony to Congress about what's, you know, then called the greenhouse effect. And that kicks off this round of national and international conversations about how to deal with the problem. So, you know, in the lead up to that moment, there are just decades of organizing to effectively protect minority rule and corporate power in the United States and change what constitutes economic common sense here. And that's, you know, this sort of wide-ranging political project we call neoliberalism with a lot of different threads. And I'll speak very briefly about a couple of them that I lay out in the book. So, you know, there's what's known as the Virginia School of Neoliberal Economics. This guy named James Buchanan, you know, gets his start working against public education as a response to desegregation and the civil rights movement. This is, you know, simplifying the story a little bit, but the argument is essentially that if people of color are going to be allowed to attend white public schools, that public education can and should be destroyed to preserve the South's white aristocracy. And so he constructs this thing called public choice theory economics, which paints government as this greedy, self-serving sort of client state that shouldn't be trusted. And one of his earliest allies and beneficiary and donors, is Charles Koch, who's then running his family's fossil fuel empire. People might be familiar also with the Chicago School, people like Milton Friedman, who are part of this real wave of business conservatism that involves this really ideologically motivated network of right-wingers going around and convincing CEOs from what are still today some of the biggest polluting companies on earth to fund academic departments, to fund think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, publications like the National Review, radio shows like the Mannion Forum. And these are all really dedicated to changing the public debate about government and economics and organizing class consciousness among the wealthy. And they're looking to, especially to kneecap the power of organized labor as an institution of working class power that's historically provided a check on corporate greed. And they're also, of course, interested in electoral politics. And one of the first landmark fights on this front is Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign in 1964. That doesn't succeed, but helps drag the Republican Party even farther to the right than it had been, and was a vehicle for these ideas that have been, circulating for all this time within corporations and think tanks. And Ronald Reagan makes a famous speech that puts him on the map at the RNC in 1964. And the same people who galvanized around Goldwater's campaign get behind Reagan in 1976, and then again when he wins in 1980. So there's so much work that goes into getting to that point. And this shift in politics doesn't come out of nowhere, but the Reagan administration in particular, really concretizes a lot of these right-wing ideas into law. And this process, the sort of same people who affected that change, bleed pretty directly into climate denial. There are all of these scripts for spreading disinformation developed within these flagship fossil fuel funded neoliberal institutions like AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, over the course of many, many, many decades. Most famously, that's, as Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway write about, tobacco companies fighting off claims that cigarettes cause cancer. But many of these people are also fierce anti-communists and Cold Warriors who had spent years looking to expand the military budget. And after the Cold War ends, they really latch on to global warming as their next big cause. And the fossil fuel companies know so early on that their products cause global warming, like you mentioned, and that tackling it would pose an existential threat to their business model. So them and the think tanks they funded waged this all-out campaign to stop anything at all from happening. And when world leaders start meeting to talk about the climate crisis at places like the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, all of these sort of, this decade and decades of work really comes to bear. There's this thing called the Global Climate Coalition, which is hosted at first by the National Association of Manufacturers, funded by companies like ExxonMobil, trade lobbies like the Edison Electric Institute, that go to early meetings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they try to undermine these processes, and it works. As soon as the Clinton administration agrees to the Kyoto Protocols in 1997, the GCC, Global Climate Coalition, and fossil fuel interests, they tap Chuck Hagel and Robert Byrd in the Senate to circulate a resolution against legally binding greenhouse gas emissions commitments that have been agreed to at Kyoto, and signal that the U.S. Senate will not ratify the Kyoto Protocols, which required Senate ratification. This resolution passes by a 95-0 vote, and the U.S. goes on to pull out of Kyoto under George W. Bush, and that process shapes the way, not just the U.S., but internationally, the way we talk about how to deal with this problem, including the very text of the Paris Agreement sort of comes out of that process. So, I say all this not to, just provide historical context, but, part of the inspiration for writing the book was, going to these climate talks and just getting a sense for how weird it was that climate denial was such a big part of the conversation here and such a weird US export. And I think it's really easy to think about climate politics as existing in a silo, and climate denial is this really aberrant, strange thing in the US. But, looking at the last several decades of our history here, it's really, a pretty predictable product of a lot of right-wing politics, I think.
And because they lied to us and hid what they knew, we lost so many decades. We could have made an incremental transition away from fossil fuels to renewable. Now it's a real crisis. Our carbon budget is so small now because they lied to us. And we still give the suckers, I'll say fuckers because I know who the audience is here. We still give them $20 billion a year after what they're doing to us. Now, listen, my next question was inspired by your op-ed in the New York Times today, which I really loved. Well, first of all, How is the neoliberal resolution and capitalism itself constrained our imaginations in the US for how to deal with the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it happens in a couple different ways. So, I think one of the most enduring legacies of the neoliberal revolution is sort of dismantling this idea that the government can or should have a positive impact on people's lives, which is, a pretty widespread belief after the New Deal made a positive impact on people's lives. And markets and the private sector become the protagonists of sort of all the good things that can happen in the United States, including dealing with climate change, because that's when we start talking about that in a real way. In the 1980s, there are fairly liberal Democrats trying to adjust to this rightward shift, as I mentioned before, and start pursuing things like New Deal ends through neoliberal means. And so I trace, how carbon pricing sort of comes about as a demand out of that sort of era. Not to say that carbon pricing or carbon tax is a bad idea, in theory necessarily, but that, market-based mechanisms get talked about as the solution, right, to climate change, as the thing that's going to get us out of this mess, is very much a product of this thinking in this era, where, I think the most common sense solutions for dealing with the problem, things like regulating companies directly, nationalizing them to wind down production, putting people to work directly to build out clean energy and remediate, things like abandoned mine lands and plug wells, those things are just taken off the table to make way for this new common sense. So I think that's like the creative project of neoliberalism, right? Of injecting these really outlandish and utopian ideas about the relationship between states and markets into the public consciousness, telling this really compelling story about that. But it's never really about small government or about sort of bringing government down to size. It is really a theory of how government should work, right, to protect markets from democracy again, and that necessarily involves a project for minority rule. But I think capitalism more generally, beyond neoliberalism, which is something a little more time limited and a sort of discrete political project, has a kind of built-in logic of endless expansion, right? And it can't really tolerate alternatives to itself. And I don't mean to sound like too much of a crude Marxist here, but the US as a capitalist country really goes to some pretty great lengths throughout the 20th century to crush alternatives to capitalism. I mean, most infamously, red baiting and anti-communism, which destroys and takes lives in the US and throughout the Cold Wars, as I think better than many people on this call, I'm sure, is responsible for absolutely brutal wars and massacres abroad. And there are just dedicated efforts to really crushing socialist organizing, social movements, left-wing unions, Black liberation struggles in the US and abroad that take a lot of good ideas out of the public debate, that really cut off a lot of creative and innovative thinking about how society should work and real alternatives for how we can live together as humans that have historically
only corporate socialism is allowed, yes. Right? So the United States has veto power over certain decision-making bodies like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, World Trade Organizations. Can't the US use that power to force them to make good on its Paris goals? I mean, you pointed out in your New York Times op-ed today that these institutions meet the needs of a world that doesn't exist anymore, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been this sort of strange process through the last, several decades, as long as we've been talking about climate change, right? There have been these parallel tracks. On one hand, you have these summits, things like the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then on the other hand, you have really powerful institutions like the WTO, like the IMF and the World Bank, that have real power to shape flows of carbon and capital throughout the world. And so these two things have just been so separate for so long. And what that means is that, the Paris Agreement, I think it's an important document. It's good that it exists, but it has very little power to actually meet its goals of keeping warming by well below 2 degrees. And that power does really exist in these institutions. It's not, it's not as if the US goes around and yells at some people at the WTO that we're going to fix the problem, right? But there are all of these tools just laying on the table, waiting to be used, by the US, which, it is responsible for only 15% of global emissions, but has so much power as it's an empire, right? The US is an empire. The US is like the most powerful country on earth, is the biggest economy on earth, and can really throw its weight around in a way that it's not. And I think, as much as we've seen the conversation progress domestically on climate change in the last, several months, I would say, like through the Biden administration, I haven't seen that yet extended internationally in the same way, to include a conversation about, these trade agreements and WTO and IMF and World Bank.
Where should the pressure come from here? Is it the UN Secretary General? Is it the Biden administration? Is it John Kerry? Who should be doing that pressure work?
Well, I think, this is maybe a crude reading of history, but I think it comes from below, right? I think these institutions, politicians don't do anything on their own if they're not really sort of forced with public pressure to do it. I mean, that's a big lesson from the New Deal, right? Is that, there were 4,500 strikes in 1937, and, unions, pushed the Roosevelt administration through the course of the 1930s to do more. The things that we remember as being good about the New Deal come out of, a threat of open revolt in the United States. And I think it's only going to be through pressure from below that happens. And that's, that's been the story of how the climate conversation has changed.
Absolutely, too. Yeah. Okay, the United States could push creditors, including China, to embrace widespread debt relief. Using such a burden is a precondition for many countries to cope with worsening weather. Don't you? Well, I know you think so. You wrote it.
Yeah. And I think this is another thing that, is a real shame about the climate conversation being so limited to US borders in some way, right? We know that carbon doesn't respect borders. It doesn't really have a concept of the nation state. And it doesn't matter if emissions go up over New York City, where I am, or in Shenzhen, right? We're all, on this planet together. And the fact is that the US has an enormous historical responsibility for this crisis. We've, poured an enormous amount of carbon into the air by, making ourselves very rich. And that's involved stealing, right, from other people, stealing land and labor, exploiting land and labor from all over the world. And we really owe a lot to other countries. And, I don't think I don't think of that as a trade-off. I don't think of that as something which is going to make people's lives in the US worse, but it's just a recognition that, we really are all in this fight together. And, we're a very, very rich country and have a lot of resources available to us to help make an energy transition possible for, other places that we've taken a lot of wealth from, frankly. And, can really have a common cause in wanting to take on this crisis. And that's just not going to happen, I think, without a good faith commitment from the US, not just to bring down our own emissions really quickly as we can, but to make that possible for other countries.
So, it's one thing to look at fossil fuel companies saying that they're going to plant some more trees and call that greenwashing. But in your book, you describe some way more insidious kinds of greenwashing. Well, tell us, what are fossil fuel companies doing to distort their public image and policy debates, and how has that changed in the last few years?
Yeah, so, I talked a little bit earlier about the Global Climate Coalition and things like the Heritage Foundation. And these, are not really where the conversation that's slowing down progress is anymore, right? These institutions are sort of shrinking. They're a little bit pathetic. And ExxonMobil, for instance, stopped funding climate deniers in like 2007. And they've moved on to other things, and that looks a lot murkier than it did when they just said it didn't exist. I mean, I always think about the thing burned into my memory is the thing I write about in the book, which is going to a panel put on by something called the International Emissions Trading Association, which is this trade lobby essentially at the UN that goes to all the UN climate talks and, is comprised entirely, largely of fossil fuel producers, almost entirely of fossil fuel producers from around the world. So I'm sitting at one of these sessions sort of tucked into like, this little booth cordoned off in a big conference center I think it was in Poland, in Katowice when the talks were there. And I'm just, I'm taking notes and like sitting, not really, paying too much attention. I'm a little like dehydrated and underslept and just, going along. And this executive from Shell, who heads up their climate work, just says in the middle of the session, there's like 30 people in suits in this room. We wrote this part of the Paris Agreement. We, were in the room, we made some suggestions, and we put a proposal forward, and what came out looks a lot like our proposal, Article 6, the part of the agreement that deals with mitigation and coordinating emissions between countries, and said it with a totally straight face, right? And this is Shell Oil, one of the biggest fossil fuel producers on Earth, really not on any sort of track to bring down its emissions in any way. Knew about the climate crisis just like ExxonMobil in the 1980s, well before it was being talked about publicly, fueled the same kinds of disinformation efforts, and is now getting an audience with governments who are deciding how to take on the climate crisis. I mean, we're seeing, there's example after example after example of this happening, but I think the trend is that these companies are staking a claim to how to deal with this problem and trying to position themselves as good faith actors in this fight that we have no evidence to suggest that they should be, right? They've only ever delayed action. They've only ever, misled the public and kept sort of, fueling the same thing they've been doing. And we know they can exist going into the future, but a lot of people still believe them.
Kate, what's the Green New Deal that you lay out in the book? And what are the big lessons of the New Deal for the Green New Dealers?
Yeah, so the Green New Deal, I think it's important to say, is not, a discrete set of policies, but a sort of framework for governance, right? Like the New Deal itself, right? It's an era and style of governance that, sets a container in which policy can happen and which different policies can happen. And I think it's, contestable, right? The original Green New Deal resolution didn't include everything I might have wanted it to. As you mentioned, it doesn't include any language about fossil fuels, for instance. But I think it's something to be fought over, and that, there can be a sort of conversation about what that includes, just like the New Deal, right? There was a fight, active fights from movements and from unions to make the New Deal what it was. And I think the Green New Deal is similar in that regard, right? And so the Green New Deal I lay out in the book is really trying to put some of the ideas that the neoliberal revolution took off the table back onto the table. So bringing up questions like public ownership of utilities, of electric utilities that, funded these same disinformation efforts, are fueling the problem as we know it, are, shouldering people with huge energy burdens, fighting renewables in the States, bringing those companies under public ownership, nationalizing the fossil fuel industry to create a sort of guide path toward a just transition for people that we should not trust fossil fuel companies to create for themselves. They'll take the money and run and lay off as many people as they can. I talk about the idea for full employment, which was, in the Democratic Party platform until 1980, and a huge demand of social movements after, in the 1970s, and has been weirdly, direct employment, direct hiring is not talked about as much as it should be, but presents a real path toward doing the sorts of work that we know is valuable and necessary for dealing with the climate crisis, but that is not valued by the private sector. Nobody's going to make a lot of money remediating wetlands, right? Or by going to care for folks in homes, just have conversations with people who, don't get to have conversations that much, doing this sort of valuable socially and ecologically necessary work that's just not profitable, right? And there's a big role for the federal government to play in those sorts of things. Talk about a 4-day work week, which, I would personally love. And I think a lot of people, would be excited to have 3-day weekends to, pick up that historic demand of the labor movement for shorter work weeks would be incredible. really sort of building out the foundations for a good society through public policy and through really making the case that the government can make a difference in people's lives. So that's one aspect of it, right, is the policies themselves. And I think an important lesson from the New Deal itself, and that the Green New Deal, I think, is really acting in the spirit of, is to build a coalition for itself, right? The New Deal created the New Deal coalition, right, by making material improvements in people's lives, by expanding the power of unions and giving people a voice in their workplaces, in their democracies, at every level of government. The Green New Deal has to do the same thing for very pragmatic reasons, I think, which is to create democratic, small d democratic and big D democratic majorities that can sustain the project of decarbonization for the next decade. At least, and do the same thing that the New Deal did, of just creating democratic majorities that could keep this up.
And we should remember what Roosevelt said when the New Deal coalition made a lot of noise and were making all these demands of him. And he said, "I agree with you. Now go out and make me do it." What we have to do.
It's a good lesson for the Biden administration.
Biden was the one that maybe he's the one we can make do it.
Maybe, yeah, he's definitely surprised a lot of people, including myself.
So there's an enormous amount of work to be done repairing the land that fossil fuel extraction has destroyed, from plugging I think it's 3.1 million abandoned wells, to reclaiming abandoned land, land that mines have destroyed. Why is nationalizing the fossil fuel industry, as you talk about in the book, a good way to do that and bring about a just transition?
Yeah, I think there is just such a bad track record from how fossil fuel companies have gone bankrupt before, right? I mean, we've seen this all throughout coal country, where coal executives, coal bosses will go bankrupt, will write off millions of dollars worth of obligations to both environmental remediation and their own workers, right, of trying to get out of payments to things like the Black Lung Fund that helps people who worked in the mines, who helped build this country's energy system, and tries to short them out of healthcare and sort of basic rights and pensions and all these things. And that is a canary in the coal mine for what the future of fossil fuel bankruptcies will look like. We know that we can't be burning fossil fuels. And I don't think we should trust fossil fuel companies to make sure that transition happens in any sort of just way. And, I think there's a debate, right, about whether we should just regulate them out of existence and sort of say, mining for fossil fuels is illegal, make it much more expensive, all that. But people are left behind in that process, right? And that if we trust, ExxonMobil or Chevron or BP or any of these companies to do right by their workers, they're just not going to do it. And even worse, they'll sell off those drilling assets to private equity vultures, to other smaller drilling companies who aren't under the same kind of scrutiny. And they'll keep drilling. They'll just keep drilling into the atmosphere and continue firing people until we're blown past 2 degrees Celsius, right? And so I talk about nationalization as a way to sort of make that process make sense, right? I don't think it makes sense otherwise. These companies are not going to wind down emissions of their own accord. They are not going to do right by their workers. And so the government, can, as it does in basically every other fossil fuel producing country on earth, take stewardship of those assets, right? We already bailed out the fossil fuel industry. We've done it, just in the last year through the COVID-19 lockdowns and oil prices crashed, and there were no strings attached, right? There were no strings to keep people on the payroll, to make sure that people didn't get thrown out during the middle of a pandemic. And so what nationalizing the fossil fuel industry can do is both, as we bring those assets down to size, and fossil fuel subsidies, make sure that these companies aren't overvalued in the ways that they are now, we can keep people on payroll and put them to work plugging abandoned wells, of which there are a ton, 3.1 million, as you said, reclaiming abandoned mine lands, doing work that's already close to home, right? This is work that they don't need to travel 200 miles to do. And it's right there. And it's not, going to make sense to bring in like Halliburton to plug up a well or something. I don't think that's, the future we want. necessarily. So just, keep people on payroll. The federal government can pay people to do this necessary work.
Yeah. So this is my last question before you, and then we're going to go to audience questions. But tell me what an ideal day would look like if the Green New Deal became a reality.
So I can only speak for myself and what my ideal day would look like. But I think, it would look a little something like waking up on a Friday morning. It's the weekend. We have a 4-day work week. Probably, smoking some legal weed because we should legalize marijuana in every part of this country, and let prisoners out of jail who've been wrongly imprisoned for the crime of smoking weed, which is insane. And might call a friend, go to a public park that's been created or renovated by a new civilian conservation corps, by workers making a living wage who have benefits in a union, maybe taken a play put on by a new federal theater project that is paying actors and directors and screenwriters to put on really high production value plays that they did during the New Deal, and enjoy this long luxurious weekend. Maybe if we feel like it, go to take high-speed rail to the beach to take in the sunset, drink some wine, grown by vintners who are paid to sequester carbon in their fields, and then not have to worry about working a second or third job to make ends meet. If you have a child can be in childcare, during the week, and public childcare on the weekends. That's beautiful and luxurious, and creates just incredible experiences for children. And then go back home at the end of the day to a beautiful social housing complex that has bars and restaurants and grocery stores and daycares and all of these other amenities that are very common in other parts of the world. And we just don't have here because we decided that's not a thing that's worth investing in. And go back to your job, making your very green job as a teacher or a nurse, making a living wage.
Beautiful. Oh, it's the first time I've wanted to be young in a long time, so I could live to see it. So let's begin to take some audience questions, because I know there's really smart people out there. Brittany?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. We have a couple about the Biden administration. So how each of you think the Biden administration is doing on climate change. Are you seeing climate and political economic reforms that are channeling against neoliberal governance in this new administration?
I'll answer the first part. You answer the second part. I think that listen, first of all, it's just so nice to be able to hope again. It just feels so good. The Biden administration is doing so much better than I ever would have imagined. It may actually become, as Natalie Goldberg said in an article in the New York Times, an inflection presidency. There was FDR, big activist government that worked for the people. There was, or at least most of the people, not all of the people. And then there was Reagan, shrink it all down, raise up individualism, the next inflection. Maybe Biden is going to be a new FDR, only not leaving anyone behind. I really like how he is centering justice. I think that is so important. I'm very encouraged by many of his appointments. But just like FDR, he needs to be pressured. We have to stay vigilant. We have to keep the pressure on. What we've learned during his campaign and then in these almost 100 days is that he can be pressured. He can be moved. So it's up to us, people power, to pressure him. Kate, you talk about the neoliberalism part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer would be pretty similar, right? And I think, I would agree with what you said, Jane, for maybe cynical reasons, right? Which is that I think Biden is kind of a weather van. I think most politicians are sort of weather vans, and they respond to the conditions that they create.
Totally.
And movements have created a very different set of conditions than even Obama had in 2008, right? And I think that has, created a different political atmosphere. It's created a different set of advisors, right, that are surrounding Biden and were surrounding Obama. There is not a Larry Summers, thank God, in the Biden administration. There's not a Timothy Geithner in the Biden administration. There are, genuinely wonderful, smart, progressive people, I think, who are surrounding Joe Biden. And on climate in particular, I think what we can thank for a lot of the bigger, not big enough things that the Biden administration doing is, things like the Fridays for Future, things like the climate strikes, things like the fight against
Sunrise.
the Keystone XL, Sunrise, Fragile Fridays, all the sort of uprising of movements in the last decade on climate, Occupy Wall Street, the movement for Black Lives, has created these really different conditions and will, if the Biden administration does move to, leave neoliberalism behind, which I think it's a little too early to say at this point whether that'll be the case, but if it does happen, and I think it can, I think it will be, owed to movements having made that happen.
So this question goes just to what Jane said about keeping the Biden administration and other officials accountable. What are the best ways to do that with corporations and government entities?
Kate?
Well, Jane, I feel like you've been doing more activism than I have the last while. So, but
well, I think what's interesting is that the scientists, they're nerds. They're always under the radar. God forbid anybody should say I'm political. They are actually saying we need unprecedented numbers in the streets, making the demands. What has to happen is large numbers of people. That was what was so profoundly changing about the 2019 global student uprisings, is that they lasted so long and they were so huge, the biggest protests in history. It's what did it in the New Deal, millions of people in the streets, and it has to be what happens now. I don't think it's probably true of the audience that's watching, but I just want to say it. Individual actions, the plastic straws and all, that's all important. And if you can afford an electric car, by all means get one, or at least hybrid, and so on and so forth. These are all very important, but guess what? Even if every one of us did it, it couldn't be scaled up in time. We have to join organizations and we have to be organized, strategically organized. That's what will do it.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And I think there's a virtuous cycle that climate policy can create that I talked about a little while ago, right? And that policy can make people's lives better in the short term, can build the coalition needed to pass more policy, which we need. We know there's an enormous amount of work to do for decarbonization. I think, there isn't a path to dealing with this crisis that doesn't run through getting state power. And I think the way to do that is to really make people believe that government can make a good difference in people's lives. And that, in our case, that the Democratic Party can make a good difference in people's lives.
This person says, are there not coordinated efforts to boycott the companies that are the biggest contributors to global warming? I think that people being more aware of our economic/purchasing power might make changes on a personal level.
Well, I was, there are a lot of efforts, right? I was involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement all through college. And that was an effort to remove university endowments, an enormous amount of money from the fossil fuel industry at the investment level. I think part of the thing that's hard about this is that, capitalism runs on fossil fuels, right? It's very hard to boycott fossil fuels if you live under capitalism, just because that's, the way our system runs. But I think that organized campaigns that really raise the pressure on companies and on government officials, especially, to rein in these companies, I would argue to nationalize them, that can do a lot of good. So I think boycotts are a really good idea and a really smart tactic when embedded in a strategic campaign.
I agree.
Ria asks, are there countries or areas making progress in reversing emissions? And if so, how are they doing it?
there's some progress. Like the U.S. Is certainly a laggard on this regard, but there are, some signs of progress in New York State. We passed a law called Local 97, which will create, hundreds of thousands of union jobs over the next several years by retrofitting buildings in New York City, which are the biggest contributor to the state's emissions. So on the local level, I think that's where I would look. Internationally, countries like New Zealand have started phasing out drilling. Costa Rica has started doing this. Germany, for instance, has created a just transition as part of its coal phase out by bringing unions onto the boards and sort of having them have a say in what this transition looks like. I think there are a lot of really positive examples for what this looks like. Not enough, certainly, but there are a lot of places doing better than the U.S. is doing on this front.
Brittany, back to you.
Sharon White says, I first heard public discussion of climate change in the late 90s. Then the view was nuclear power could solve the problem, but many activists preferred to wait for new science to develop. Is this conversation still relevant? Is nuclear part of the realistic solution? Is it the right kind of science being supported and science education being encouraged for and by younger activists?
It's a very loaded question, I would say, the nuclear question. I personally, and there I think is a very good debate to be had about this, that I don't come down strongly on in the book. I think is a real debate to be had about nuclear power, but I think as of now, it's hard to imagine nuclear companies dealing with waste. We don't have a good solution for how to deal with nuclear waste, which is a huge environmental justice disaster in many parts of this country, including places you wouldn't necessarily expect. Nuclear plants are really, really expensive, right? That they're much harder to finance than building out the sort of equivalent power in wind and solar. It's really hard to get projects off the ground. Existing nuclear plants are shutting down because they're uneconomical. I think that's probably the part of the debate that's thorny us is what happens to the existing nuclear fleet. You will not find a lengthy treatment of that in the book, but what I do try to do in the book is set out sort of like a moral framework for thinking through these questions, which is, who owns this? Who's making decisions about where waste goes, right? If we are in a sort of democratic plan for decarbonization, then the communities which would have to deal with nuclear waste would have a real say in what happens to waste and whether a project gets greenlit that is going to put waste in their backyard. And I think that has to be the sort of foundation of that discussion, is whether people who are actually affected by the types of power plants that are coming into their communities have a say in the sorts of effects that they create. So that's a little bit of a sidestep answer, but I think we really need to think critically about what democracy looks like in thinking through the nuclear power question and pay really close attention to communities that are already sort of feeling the brunt of nuclear waste in particular.
Yeah. And, as the person who co-produced and starred in the China Syndrome, I do have opinions on it. I agree with everything that Kate has said. There's also water is going to become a very scarce resource. There will be wars fought over water. Nuclear plants require ginormous amounts of water that is then heated up and put back into bodies of water, which are then despoiled. The fish and the wildlife and the creatures that live in the water are harmed, and the water itself is harmed, aside from the problem with the waste that Kate mentioned. But here's the thing. The plants that exist, that are the nuclear plants that exist and that appear to be relatively safe and are not super old, will be left in place right now, because we won't get to the reduction of fossil fuels that we need to without the help of those existing plants. New plants will not be built. They take too long. They're too expensive. They use too much water, and they take forever. We don't have that kind of time. So just leave the ones that are there. There's a number that are being decommissioned, partly because they're old and partly because they're being affected by climate change, rising sea level and so forth.
Wholeheartedly agree. Yeah.
There are a couple of questions here about capitalism. First, Paul wants to know, is capitalism the chief culprit for problems of the environment and social justice? And Leonardo wants to know how American capitalism has affected the environment worldwide outside of our country.
Can I just say something about the first part of that question, please? I have spent a lot of time in socialist countries. I'm not a communist, but I've spent a lot of time in socialist countries and communist countries, Eastern Europe and so forth. I have never seen such destruction of the environment as I saw in socialist countries. I'm not talking about democratic socialism. I'm talking about state socialism. So let's not fool ourselves that there are other isms that are better, that socialism or communism is better, state socialism and communism is better than capitalism when it comes to the environment. Okay, I just wanted to say that because I have firsthand experience.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, right? And that the USSR certainly was not a climate-friendly country. I think China's neither democratic nor it's interesting conversation, maybe for a different time. But I think there's a bigger thing happening, and Naomi Klein makes this point, and this changes everything, which is there's a real logic of domination over the earth that is, I think, pretty endemic to a lot of thinking, particularly in the West and in parts of the East, and in the USSR, I'm thinking about in particular, through post-Enlightenment, really, of that humans can dominate the earth, and that it's just a problem to be solved, that we can figure out some technological fix that will allow us to really figure nature out and win out over it. And that's a very different relationship than exists in many indigenous communities, right? Of living sort of in concert with the earth, and having a more sort of back and forth relationship with it, and I think it's not sort of relegated only to capitalism. It's not endemic to socialism. I would identify as a socialist, but I think there's a real strain of thinking through the last 400, 500 years that says humans should really have dominion over the planet, and I think that's the wrong way to approach this problem, and that's really bled through regardless of sort of ideology, and is a deeper problem to think through about what is our relationship to the planet. And I think there is a lot of work to be done repairing the sort of harms that have been done in many countries to the earth, and that I think we need to really think through what I would argue for a 21st century socialism, for an eco-socialism. And I think anything that's not really thinking deeply about those questions is not responsible. I don't think it makes sense to repeat the 20th century at all, and really need to be thinking creatively about what building a good society looks like, which we don't have a good blueprint for doing that in a big world, in a big country, in a giant economy, but I think that is the challenge of the climate crisis, and what it presents to us is to really figure out how to build a good life for as many people as possible, with living within planetary boundaries. And I think that's the challenge. And I don't think I don't think we have a great answer, right? We're not going to look back to to Marx and find that in it. I think we can find a.
Isn't it called democracy?
Yes.
I mean, with democracy, there'd be no patriarchy, and there probably would be no climate crisis with democracy. And there may not be capitalism with democracy. I don't know. I mean, did you read Stiglitz's book about capitalism? Maybe if capitalism has so many regulations to keep it in check that there actually could be a democratic socialism, maybe that's what could happen.
Yeah, I mean, my idea of democratic socialism is, democracy in every part of life, right? At the workplace, in the home, in our political systems, right? I think that is the highest expression of democracy, and I think that's my vision for the world. And I try to make the point in the book, but I think that's the kind of route it runs through is, democracy in as many parts of life as possible.
This question has a lot of votes. Is a carbon emissions cap and trade type program just a way for people to pay to pollute?
The longest chapter in the book, I got cut down mercifully by my editor, was about the cap and trade fight in 2009 to 2010. So there's a very extended treatment of this question, both on the sort of theory of carbon pricing, and how it comes about, why it becomes a popular demand, and the politics of it, which I think are probably the most relevant for this question in particular. So, in the United States, cap and trade, we tried to pass it about a decade ago with the bill called Waxman-Markey that included a lot of other things that were not strictly about emissions trading, right? Included a lot of investment in clean energy, included a lot of, things that I think are good ideas, certainly. But the political strategy to pass it was really flawed. The theory of change was that if we rally together business leaders, including some of the biggest polluters in the country, Duke Energy, BP, ConocoPhillips, that would be the sort of key that unlocked Republican support, that we could build a bipartisan alliance by bringing the polluting companies into that coalition. And it didn't work. Right? And so why didn't it work? And that shaped what the demand was. That shaped why it was a cap and trade program, in part because it was something that was amenable to these companies, because you could build in giveaways. You could build in an enormous amount of allowances into the system that would allow companies to keep polluting and to buy the right to pollute. So I think the policy itself has a lot of really deep flaws, which are on display in California, as Jane might know well, in the cap and trade system there. And the coalition fell apart, right? We didn't get cap and trade, which, I think there's a debate about whether that would have been good if it passed. But what the polluting companies who were as part of the coalition to pass it did was turn around as they were watering down the policy and fund trade lobbies and fund political efforts to stop anything from passing, right? There was no contradiction between that. They could be part of the coalition watering down policy, and they could fund efforts to make sure it didn't pass. And that's exactly what happened. And we don't have comprehensive climate policy 10 years later because we made that bargain. And that coalition rallied against the very idea of carbon pricing, right? And so that, is just the world we live in now, where carbon pricing has been really run through the ringer in the US, or existing scripts on the right for how to deal with it and how to fight it that are really effective and that, tend to work. So I think it's, it's important to examine the policy in itself, which I think is flawed, and I think it's important to examine the political strategy behind it, which I also think is flawed. So I think we should do something else that is not cap and trade nationally.
Here's an interesting question that also has a lot of votes. In a country that routinely punishes citizens, both locally and internationally, for dissent, what would you say to people to embolden them to advocate for global climate justice?
Jane, do you want to take that question first?
Because so much is at stake. The future is at stake, and we can't just let the young people do it on their own. I mean, we are the last living generation on planet Earth that can make the decision about whether there'll be a future or not. What we do is what's going to determine the future, because we have barely a decade. And so how can we not do everything we can and bring as many people along with us? Listen to this. According to the Yale Project on Climate and Communications, there are 25 million Americans who are really alarmed about climate but haven't done anything about it because nobody asked. There are 13 million of them who would engage in civil disobedience and haven't because nobody asked. We have to do more asking. We have to ask everybody, every member of our family, every person we know at work, everybody we come in contact with. join an organization and become active to save the future. And then we have to get a lot of really good lawyers.
Yeah, I would agree totally. And I think, there are different levels of risk, right, for people. And I'm fairly privileged, have been arrested, and do not have, the most conflictual relationship with law enforcement. That is not the case for everyone. Not everyone goes through the criminal justice system like I would. And there are many, many different roles for people to play. I think getting arrested is a hugely important one. And I think, doing civil disobedience is essential, basically, really posing a disruption to business as usual. And there's a lot of deep organizing, knocking doors, campaigning for squad members, and in Congress. There's so much work to be done. There's really no shortage of things that can happen. And I think yes, good lawyers are essential too.
But because I remember back during the 70s, during the Vietnam War, we could flood congressmen's offices with mail, and boy, did it have an effect. We have to shut their phone lines down. We have to fill their hallways. We can do it, but that's what it's going to take.
Make their lives very hard until they do the right thing. Yes.
This is interesting. Why is population control so rarely mentioned as a contributing factor to reduce emissions? Is the religion factor, I'm assuming he's talking about like family first, so powerful that this isn't mentioned?
I talk about this briefly in the book. I think in a lot of, as it's been advocated in a lot of places, population control has been a euphemism for white supremacy. In the climate space. People like Garrett Hardin, named by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a white nationalist, advocated very fondly for population control. And often, it's hard for me to imagine an instance of that coming up when the object of that when the object of that is a white person, right? Is someone who is not from the United States. And I think that that conversation has evolved, but I think that that language is really concerning and is a really slippery slope, I think. And we know corporations are the problem, right? It's like that is the problem, is that there are fossil fuel companies who have been polluting this planet for decades. It's not that there's too many people, right? It's not that there are people have too many babies, right? It's that we have a set of corporations. We have an economic system which prioritizes and relies on the exploitation of land and labor. That's the problem.
Well, there are too many people on a finite planet, but the solution is education and empowering girls. I've been in enough third world countries to know that when girls are educated and empowered and have a job and bring home money, they're able to negotiate contraception. They're able to negotiate the number and spacing of their children. That's if you're concerned about numbers of people, that's how to do it.
Totally. Yeah.
There are still so many questions in the chat, but unfortunately we're out of time. But that just proves how important this conversation is and how interested people are in it. And it's so apt, Kate, that your book is out during the week of Earth Day, because this is the number one priority. I mean, there is nothing above it to save our planet. And I hope you all will buy both of these books. They are the perfect companion to learn about climate change, to find out what you can do personally, because there are so many things that each of us can do, no matter where we are or what our abilities are. Tomorrow is actually Independent Bookstore Day, so definitely go support your independent bookstores. The big corporation that shall not be named is not good for the environment. So definitely don't purchase from them. Purchase from your local indie. Kate and Jane, this has been so wonderful, so informative. I just love how passionate each of you are about this topic. And some people were commenting in the Q&A, they both just say thank you so much to both of you for your work and how they are inspired by you, and I am as well.
Thank you, Brittany. And thank you so much, Kate, for just being who you are and for writing your book.
Jane, thank you so much doing this. You know, the 9 to 5 poster I have in the background of this office is just shining right now for you. And, you know, I'm just so grateful for all of your work. Yeah, innumerable value to this country. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Everyone, please have a great weekend. Stay well and stay well read, and we'll see you next time.